Talking Drums. I'm your host, Ken Marino, and this is a weekly show where we look at the history and development of the drum set. Drum set that appears before me right now actually is an instrument that took many, many decades to develop. The drum set comes from America. It's an American invention. And all the pieces that go into the drum set all have origins in different parts of the world. The drum set began when musicians would bring their small groups into dance halls and bars and clubs so people could dance. So the first thing that the drummer would use was the bass drum and the snare drum. And so the drummer would do something like this. The thing that really made the drum set happen was in the 1890s was the invention of the bass drum pedal. Because before that, the drummer would have to use one hand on the bass drum with a stick or a mallet, one hand on the snare drum. So the invention of the bass drum pedal allowed the drummer to just freed up the drummer's hands to play just the snare drum. So as the drum set started to develop, it became known as the trap set. And the trap set is short for contraption because drummers would have a host of different effects that they would need. Here we have a China cymbal, a very small China cymbal. You can hit it, you mount it upside down. And so if you're in a pit band or you were playing with a big band and you needed a sound like that, ladies and gentlemen, we now take you to China. And the drummer would have these effects that he could use to create the sounds of that specific area of the world. Now, the other big invention with the drum set was the hi-hat. Originally it was called a low boy because it was down low. Slowly it came up higher and higher. It was down low because when it was originally invented, what it was invented to do was to work opposite your bass drum. So that when you're in a marching band situation, you had your bass drum, your crash cymbals, and your snare drum. So the invention of the hi-hat created that same trio of instruments for your drum set. And a lot of people will tell you even today, this is where it all happens, the hi-hat, the bass drum, and the snare drum, even now, well over 100 years after the invention of the drum set. So now we have our hi-hat, we could do. The next big invention that came to define the drum set were the tom-toms. And the nice thing about the tom-toms is that they offered more of a melodic contour that now drummers could use. The original tom-toms that they used were actually of Chinese origin. They're little red drums with heads over them, and the heads were pinned on, so if you put your stick through the head, you had to go out and buy another one. It was really Gene Krupa who enlisted the Slingerland Company to develop a tom-tom that was tunable, that had a replaceable head, that brought it in to the context of the rest of the drums in the drum set. So if you listen to something like Louis Primus' Sing, Sing, Sing from 1936 with the Benny Goodman Orchestra, allow the drum set. So really, from that point on, that would define the drum kit. And often you would have a snare drum, bass drum, two toms. It wasn't until later that drummers like Papa Joe Jones with the Count Basie Orchestra started to add a second floor tom. And if you look at a lot of drummers, Louis Bellson, Buddy Rich, they added the second floor tom, but they would both be 16 inches. And Papa Joe actually would put it one on each side so we could do things like this. That became part of his signature style. But the basic context of the up mounted and the two floor toms came to be more popular in the 1950s. In the 1960s, you started to have the development of the up-mounted toms here. When they first came out, they would actually have two 12s or two 13s. So you could get a kit that would have two 13s and two 16s, or one 16, and that wasn't really as useful for drummers. They actually started to trade them off. Hey, I bought mine with a 12. Want to switch off the 13? And I'll give you. And so drummers started to switch them off, and then the 12, 13, 16 became the standard. Later on, you have what you have here, which became the studio standard, 10, 12, 14. And I have the addition of the 16 here. So it gives me two up, two down. This was very popular with rock drummers. Ginger Baker had two up, two large 13, 14-inch toms, two down, 16 and 18. And then also two large bass drums. And that became very the signature classic rock drum kit. The other thing we have are these cymbals. You have two types of cymbals. You have your crash cymbal, and you have your suspended cymbal. These are actually of Turkish origin. The Zildjian family brought them over, but they also have Chinese origin as well. You have Chinese cymbals that came from China, and the gong and the tam-tam that came from China. And of course your hi-hat is another cymbal. This is my practice kit. I only have two cymbals on the practice kit. I really do like to use at least one other, if not two other cymbals, because if you go around the drum kit, it doesn't give you anywhere to go. You have to come all the way back to hit the cymbal that's here. But this is just for practicing, so I use my imagination. So that basically is the drum kit. Now another thing that we have in the traps, you can have a host of different instruments. I have this little apparatus here with two cowbells and a woodblock. These would become standard in big bands and more so pit bands and pit orchestras where you needed these effects for the theater or for some kind of a show that you were doing. And then everything else, you have that you could use. I have a nice, it's a very inexpensive, I think I only paid $10 for this, maybe $20, You can mount your tambourine. Many times people have put it, used to be very popular, put it on top of your hi-hat, maybe to have some ringers or some other types of chicks that would go on your hi-hat. And so these are things that drummers use and have used throughout the drumming history. The triangle is another very, very popular instrument. Again, you can mount it if you have a little area, little stand. You can mount these instruments and have them, which is necessary if you're doing Broadway shows or other types of stage shows where you need a lot of various effects. But these instruments and the various percussion effects, they're very useful for any drummer. Whether you're doing a pop song or a classic rock tune, they really come in handy. So once you have the drum kit and it's marry it, its international origin, now we use it as one instrument. A variety of instruments, the tom-toms, Chinese origin. Also, you have African drums, very similar to this, so they're kind of a cross hybrid of African drums and Chinese drums. You have your cymbals. You have your bass drum and your snare drum from the marching bands. Snare drum goes back to the 16th century. It was used in marching bands. The bass drum was very popular in marching bands throughout the 1900s. And your various different, what we call traps or percussion instruments, triangles, wood blocks, cowbells, that you could use for different effects. That makes up your drum kit. And so it's a very, very new instrument. It's an instrument that's developing. I have a double bass drum pedal. I have, for many years, a double bass drum kit. My first kit actually had two 24-inch bass drums, 13, 14, 16, and 18. Very much like the Ginger Baker kit that was very standard for rock drummers. But once you start gigging a lot, you realize that, you know, having a 24 or 26-inch bass drum is not always convenient. And also having a lot of toms. Now, they're not only difficult to transport, they're difficult for your sound man, because now you might have to use, you know, a myriad of mics to set them up. You might not have the inputs for that, unless you're going to then have your own sound system, which is another thing to load. A lot of times when you play out, you know, you have a kit that's available to you and you just sit down and play. So the sound man has it set up the way he wants, and you do what you need to do. You don't move that kit, you don't change it, you do what you do. I've played in clubs where, you know, you walk into the drum kit and it's nothing but duct tape and terry cloth, you know. And gosh, you know, how are you going to get a sound out of this? But, you know, you listen to it when you're out, and maybe there's a band preceding you, and you say, my God, the guy gets a really nice sound out of that. Soundmen can do amazing things. So once you have your drum kit, I would recommend also for beginners, the smaller the better. You know, what I have now is very, very custom, very, very standard. It's a 22 by 18, 10, 12, and 14. Anything larger in the toms, you know, you can get 13, 14, 12, 13, 16. You know, it's really not necessary, especially for a practice kit. And especially for a drummer who's beginning. A 10-inch tom with a 13 or 14-inch tom here, an 18 or 20-inch bass drum with a nice snare drum, and you're ready to go. And it's nice to have 80 cymbals. You know, if you can afford it, you know, hey, it's nice to have. I collect sticks. They're a lot cheaper. But, you know, you need your hi-hat, a crash cymbal. It might be more useful to have the crash cymbal over here. But if you get a crash ride, an 18-inch medium cymbal that you could use as both a crash or a ride, that's what I use this for, even though it's a 20-inch cymbal. You know, like I said, it's just a practice kit, right? So I have a crash over here, a cymbal over here, I have my crash over here, and you're good to go. I find often that parents will go out and they'll buy these huge kits for their kids that are just very, very clumsy. Because the other thing that you have to consider is if you have a 24-inch bass drum or even a 22-inch bass drum, and then you have a 12 by 13-inch tom or a 12 by 12-inch tom and a 14 by 12-inch tom or whatever, all of a sudden your toms are way up. And so if your child is 10 or 12 years old, you know, that kit is just going to be too big for the kid. And it's just not something that anybody needs. You could take this 10-inch tom and this 12-inch tom, and properly mic'd through the system, you could pretty much make them sound the way you want. You could tune them to sound the way you want. You could tune the heads up high, you could tune them low, you know. So it's really not necessary to have a huge kit, and it's actually preferable to have a small one, especially the noise level. I mean, a smaller kit, you know, not going to make as much noise. And we have a loud instrument. All instruments are loud. I used to live in New York City, and I lived above a kid who played baritone sax, would practice every night. And the woman who lived below me would complain every night, you know. I had an electronic kit, so, but still, you know, it makes a little bit of noise. If I'm doing some pad work, she would come up and complain, what are you doing? You know, it's like, listen to your kid. But, you know, instruments make noise, and you do need to be a little bit considerate about your neighbors, about your parents, your family members, people you're living with. And you don't need to make a lot of noise in order to enjoy the instrument, in order to practice the instrument, and in order to protect your hearing as well. So now we have our drum kit, and the question is, where do we go from here? And as I said earlier, you talk to a lot of drummers and they will say, it all happens between the bass drum, the snare drum, and the hi-hat. So I'm going to look at 2 or 3 grooves that every beginning drummer should know. The first groove is what some people call it the money beat. I call it a basic rock beat. All rock beats start off with basic 8th note pattern. Back in the 50s, they used to call this 8 to the bar. It was part of boogie woogie. You don't need to have that pattern. There are a lot of songs that don't, but the basic pattern is an 8th note pattern, and you count it 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now in the classic rock beat, you have what we call a backbeat. It comes out of the Pentecostal church and gospel music. If you think of a song like Amen, 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 you're clapping on the 2 and 4. You know the old joke, drummers don't let friends clap on 1 and 3. Amen. It's I can't even do it. It's very disconcerting for a drummer. So you have that, what we call a backbeat. And then the bass drum and the snare drum work with each other to create some sort of a rhythm. In the basic beat, you just have what we call quarter notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You add that to the 8th notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. If I were to start to name the number of songs where this is the primary beat, we would be here until July 2016. This is what you need to know to start off. And it is not something that you will never use. It's something that you will use a lot. It's something that you will come back to. And it's something that really makes you as a drummer, just being able to do a simple groove like this, what people call sitting in the groove, playing in the pocket, and playing it very well. So once you have your basic groove, you can start to add changes to it. So in what I call rock beat number 2, which is just a basic adding of 8th notes on the bass drum. So if I have the quarter notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now I can break up the quarter notes into 8th notes, break them up in half. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And you have your basic rock beat. Another beat that you'll hear all the time if you do the rhythm behind a song like We Will Rock You. Why they use that beat is basic rock beat. So knowing these 2 beats will go a long way towards helping you to become a good drummer. The second thing that we do on a drum set is what we call a fill. Fill is just going around the drums or doing some sort of a rhythmic pattern around the drums. End it with a cymbal crash, a nice bass drum at the end. It's nice if you have a cymbal over here, but I used my left hand. So the fill usually ends a section of the piece. When you see people on YouTube or wherever, and this is what they're doing, drummers is we play a groove. And then at the end of a section, whether it be the verse, the chorus, or the bridge, we might do some sort of a fill. We might do it as an introduction to a song. We might do it to end a song. It might be big. It might be very small. Depending on the musical context. But it needs to have some musical meaning. The idea of just like it's just noise. It doesn't have any musical meaning. So what I like to do with my students is just to take a basic rhythm. Let's say it would be a 16th notes. 1, 2, 3. Now you have that basic idea, and we use that as a fill. So how that's going to sound is I could do a measure of the groove. Into the fill. And you could do it just a measure of time or groove. You could do 3 measures. I like to do 3 measures. So this is what we do as drummers. Some measures of time, groove, into a fill sets up the new section. And the way that you do that, and your creativity, and your understanding of the musicality of just that, is what really defines your musicality and your ability as a drummer. So once you have that basic idea down, the idea is now to get back into the groove. So if I'm doing get back into the groove. So that's really the next step towards being a drummer. Another thing I like to do as well is change up the groove, which we'll talk about at a later date. So if you go from the verse to the chorus, you don't necessarily need to use the same groove. You could do whatever you want. You're the drummer. There's a lot of great tracks where there is no change in the groove from the verse to the chorus. But there are ways that you can mix things up and change things up very subtly that really make a big difference to the listener and to your band members as well. And so that's one thing I really enjoy working on with my students. Okay? So there's your first lesson. That is a lot to get going on, but it is also a very important part of your drumming and your drumming career. So thank you very much. I'll be back in just 1 second, and we'll look a little bit at